Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Chatty one today. Strictly speaking, this is a couple more questions that have come in through comments that ought to go in the Q's and A's, but they've come in from the same sort of subject matters come in from several people, plus a comment that's just nothing more than a response, somebody's thoughts on the subject, and it is again, like Sunday's chat, a subject rather than just a simple question and answer, which is the sort of thing I want to stick to on the Thursday video. So this first elaborate question, which is going to require a relatively elaborate answer, actually came in from Judy M and sparked the idea and fixed it in my mind of actually doing a viewer's orchid question time. So it's all her fault. Yeah. But basically it's also been backed up to a degree by Jerry the Snail, come in on the same sort of subject, although a very simplistic question. It's the same subject matter, and the subject is really geared up to: should you change the balance of your fertilizer depending on what the plant's doing? That's a sort of overview of what I want to chat about. So if your plant is producing its new growths, it's coming into its growth pattern, yeah, obviously it's going to need feeding. If you don't feed it during that phase, it will use up the resources within the plant that are available to it. Don't forget, not all nutrients stored in the plant are mobile, so some of them can't be moved around. To a degree, the most important one's probably nitrogen, that is mobile, but it'll take it away from the older parts of the plant, and they'll go pale and yellow, and maybe even drop leaves. So it's not a good idea to let the plant fend for itself during its growth period. That's the period when you need a good balanced fertilizer. Yeah, make sure there's some calcium in there to give it some substance and some strength to back up the nitrogen that you need to get things to grow. Too much nitrogen, wishy-washy growth. Not enough, weaker growth. Yeah, these nutrients have to balance. Yeah, so right, that's phase one. We've got some stuff growing, and quite honestly, as far as I'm concerned, anything that is a new structure on the plant, whether it's a new set of roots, some new growths, combination of the two, pushing up a spike, pushing out some buds, anything that is producing something new needs feed, and any of those structures need calcium. Yeah, so a feed with no calcium is not going to do so well for those new structures. Yeah, doesn't have to be huge amounts, you don't have to overdose, you don't have to go silly, but it needs some. So just make sure there's some in your feed. So that's that. And then we get on to, okay, we've got our new growths going, or they're coming up to their maturity, and the next thing the plant's logically going to do is start producing spikes or buds, depending on the type of plant. Yeah? Some produce spikes which then produce buds, some just produce buds. Yeah, straight out the canes, like the nobly dendrobiums. They don't really produce spikes, they produce buds. Whereas a cattleya is more likely to produce a spike, then some buds. Yeah, especially if you think about it, Laelia anceps, you know. It's got a metre of spike before it even thinks about getting some buds. And that's quite a large structure to produce, so it needs some help. But once we get into the flowering stage, the question comes up: should you change the balance of your fertilizer? Yeah, your main elements are your NPK. Yeah, N and K need to be somewhere near the same. They don't need to be vastly different, somewhere near it. Yeah, the P value in the middle doesn't need to be as high. Now that's the biggest level of detail you're going to get from me. That's all I would say on those three. The N and the K need to be somewhere similar, and the P value needs to be less, to a degree. I'd say about half, but it doesn't matter that much. As long as all three are there, that's the important bit. But this comes over from growing plants. not necessarily orchids. And also what happens to plants outside, growing in your garden. Trees, bushes, stuff, shrubs, things, yeah, growing outside. They're going to be subject to a winter, yeah? And it is said that increasing the K value helps harden them off and makes them more resilient to what's going to happen to them in the winter. Now I know for a fact in the bonsai world, for trees that are going to stay outside in all weathers through the winter, that is definitely regarded as essential, is to give them a high K value leading into autumn before the leaves drop. It hardens them up, ready for winter, and that applies to other types of plants as well. But what you have to ask is, what are you really doing here? Yeah? As they're heading towards winter, they've stopped growing. So are you upping the K value or dropping the N value? There's a difference. Yeah? If you've got your normal NPK feed and you up the K value, you've still got nitrogen in there. Well, what's the plant going to do with that? It's not growing. It's stopped growing. It's settling down, through autumn into winter. Stop growing. What does it want nitrogen for? So upping the K value is not necessarily the best of ideas, but dropping the N value down could be. So that's hardiness, winter hardiness. Now let's think about our orchids. Let's come back indoors, shall we? For those, well, most of us probably grow indoors. Yeah? What sort of winter are they going to get? Do they need hardening off for winter? You can answer that yourself. Do you need hardening off for winter? No, because you're not going to accept winter in your house, are you? You're going to deal with it and make it not winter. You're going to add heating and stuff, yeah? Well, that's going to apply to your plants as well. Do they need hardening off for winter in a home? In a controlled environment? Probably not. I say probably. Some may disagree. These are my views, yeah? Take them or leave them. Add your own in. Adjust accordingly. So dropping the nitrogen down in autumn sounds like a good idea until you stop and think about, what are my orchids doing in autumn? Are they all getting ready to bloom? Nope. Some of them have got new growths pushing out. Well, do they want their nitrogen reduced down? Certainly not. So think about what you're doing. You are highly likely to have plants doing entirely different things at the same time. Or are you going to go around with 2 or 3 different feeds? You can if you want. If you want to go to that level. But I can settle your mind at ease and stop you heading down that road to any great extent by just saying one thing. What do you think happens in the wild to the orchids that have survived for tens if not hundreds of thousands of years? Does Mother Nature go round adjusting the nitrogen and the K values of the little tiny bit of feed that it's going to get when it rains? No, it doesn't. They get what they're flipping well given, and what they're given is not that much. Yeah, so we go back to this, little and often is probably a lot better than, a 5-course meal once a week. So, do you need different types of fertilizer when a plant's coming into bloom? Do you think that happens in the wild? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But how many complex hybrids are there in the wild? That's going to stop you dead in your tracks, isn't it? There aren't any, are they? The best you're ever going to get in the wild is possibly a primary cross. 2 species that naturally hybridize. I've got one in here, delicatum, Dendrobium delicatum, naturally occurs in the wild, primary cross. Don't ask me what it's crossed, what the 2 species are, because I can't remember. I don't need to know. But yeah, so in the wild they get a little and often when it rains. So we're back to the wet season and the dry season. And some say that in the wet season they actually get less food, because it rains so hard and so often, everything's washed clean every day, virtually every day in the sort of areas where you get the monsoon rains. It chucks it down. Well, how much nutrient is left behind after that rain, ready for the start of the rain the next day? And the chances are there's not a lot. So I would suggest personally, just from a bit of logic, that when it rains less frequently, they might get a little bit more food because it's had chance to build up a bit. You know, a bit more decay has gone on, and then the rain washes a bit of that down. But either way, it's not going to be much. And I doubt very much whether it's going to get adjusted. You know, oh, we've got new growths on 3 of our orchids on this tree, so we better have some extra nitrogen in this rainfall. Yeah, it's not going to happen, is it? Right. Part of that question is, if you've got new growths on a plant, should you try and keep them dry? Simple answer, yes. If at all possible, don't get new growths wet. So if you're one of these spray merchants who love spraying everything and getting everything soaking wet, that's the time you're liable to lose new growths. But then if you've got the temperatures and the airflow, probably not. So again, you apply a bit of logic. You go round with your sprayer last thing in the evening because you've had a nice warm day, and then you get quite a dramatic drop in temperature overnight. And believe it or not, in jungly type areas where I've said there's good airflow, you've got movement of the air flows up the hillsides. It's a definite air movement. It almost stops dead at night because the sun goes in. The heat stops and the air settles down. So it can be quite still at night. And then you get the dew forms in the morning, everybody gets a little quick drink, and then the sun comes out, starts it all over again. It's a nice little cycle, and it works well for the orchids, and it's one of the things that we try and recreate. Right, so should you adjust your feed according to what the plant's doing? My simple answer is it's not worth the bother, quite honestly. But when you get into the more complex hybrids, you're going to have a plant that's going to produce a set of blooms that could possibly never be recreated in the wild in sheer volume and size and mass. So that's going to use a lot more energy for that plant to produce that than any of its species, relatives and distant acquaintances may have ever had to do. So you might want to think, what helps produce blooms? Is it the nitrogen? Not really. It's the other two. It's the P and the K. And other stuff. These are all working in together here. But yeah, so a bloom booster to me is nothing more than something without much nitrogen in it. It's all the rest, but without the nitrogen to any great extent. I would never remove nitrogen completely from a plant because it's an essential function within the plant's metabolism. Yeah, it's needed for functions with an S on the end, not just one. Yeah, so a growth booster, you know, that tends to up the N value. So your N and your K value, the N starts getting greater than the K value. Bloom booster, the N value gets less than the K value. And notice I'm only moving the N. I'm moving the N up and down the scale. I'm not adjusting the others. Now, that's my view. You may have different views. So the last part of the question is, for instance, if you grow outside, even if it's only for part of the year, and a plant starts producing, it's obvious it's coming into bloom, and you'd like it indoors so that you can admire the blooms, you know, while it's in bloom. When's the best time to move the plant and minimize the risk of bud blast? Yeah, bud blast by definition is normally caused by a dramatic change in an environmental factor or factors. So that can be a dramatic change in light values, dramatic change in temperatures, ridiculous increase or decrease in the drop between day and night. Yeah, cold draft is an environmental factor. You've changed a gentle airflow into an icy blast by putting it next to a crack in a window. So it's an environmental factor that's changed. Even a dramatic change in humidity. Taking a plant from, you know, that's got some buds forming, especially on Phalaenopsis, from a steamy jungle environment into your drier home environment is liable to blast the buds. It's a humidity change, so it's an environmental. So I would say, if you plan on having your plant inside to admire the blooms, move it as soon as possible before the buds form. And then the buds, spikes and buds, will form in the environment where it's going to flower. So there's no change. You're highly unlikely to get any bud blasts. Unless you've got desert dry air, in which case many buds and spikes will just fail. You know, lack of humidity. So get them moved as soon as possible. Alternative, wait till the blooms open and then move it. But sometimes, if it's dramatic, the blooms will just drop. So it's not bud blast anymore, it's bloom blast. Blasted blooms on the floor. Yeah, so go steady. Also, you've got water and feed well when in growth. When not in growth, don't. Well, a lot of plants stop growing and then start pushing out buds and spikes. They're growing. Sorry, hate to say it, but that is growth. It is new structures. New structures need some help. If you don't give it to them, it will take everything that it needs, that it can get hold of, out of the existing storage organs, which is your canes and your pseudobulbs. And if it's the type of plant that hasn't got any of those, it's not going to bloom very well, is it? So back to your things like Phalaenopsis, Vandas, yeah, Masdevallias, although they need hardly any food. I know somebody who feeds their Masdevallias about twice a year. Not twice a week, twice a year, and his bloom okay. So, you know, some really don't need much food at all. And with some, if you give them too much food, it'll do them harm. Not good. You've got to adjust to your plants. So, right, what else have we got? Other different types of orchids. I mean, there are some orchids that need to dry in between watering, whether you're feeding or not. You can dump the feed element now, just for this bit of the chat. And those that need to dry between watering, the faster that can happen, I think, the better. But again, it depends on orchid type. Yeah? Cattleyas are quite happy to go totally dry before they get their next lot of water. That could be daily, depending on what you've got them planted in or on and where you're growing them. Yeah? And I'm quite adamant that if it doesn't rain and you grow outside, your plants are going to use up the moisture in the pot a flipping sight quicker than they are in a controlled environment. Yeah? They just dry quickly outside. So you've got to keep up. Yeah? Leaving them dry for large amounts of time is not the best of ideas, you know? So it's geared up to a wet-dry cycle is necessary for some plants. The frequency depends on the environment, and you have to keep up with your environment, whatever your chosen environment is. It could be a cellar with no natural light and grow lights and artificial everything. It doesn't matter, that's your environment, that's what you've chosen. Your plants may stay wet quite a bit longer than somebody else's. Yeah? But nonetheless, a wet-dry cycle for some plants is essential. For others, a wet-dry cycle is handy to have when they're not growing. Things like the Oncidium Alliance. They don't like being totally dry, but when they're not growing, they don't mind for a short period. So you could adjust your watering for those types. Things like, you know, the Pleurothalids, your Masdevallias, Draculas, stuff like that, they don't like going dry. But again, if they're not growing at all, or are in a state of rescue, or whatever, you know, recently bought plant with hardly any roots, keeping them soggy is probably not the best of ideas. So you adjust, yeah? My Tolumnias, wet-dry cycle. They're twig epiphytes. They just hang on little twigs in low-growing shrubs and things like that. They don't very rarely found growing on a larger branch with moss on it. They do occasionally be found there, but most of the time they're just growing on twigs. So their roots don't grow in anything. They hang on to twigs. So replicating that is relatively easy, if you think about it. Just don't put them in anything, unless it's something solid, like bits of lava rock, or charcoal type stuff, or pebbles or something. They'd be happy in that. Clay balls, you know, because they're on them, they're not in it. Like a mix of small bark and sphagnum moss is probably not the best thing to put a Tolumnia in, because it's going to stay wet too long. And they are very, very fine, fragile roots. And if they stay wet too long, they'll rot. Short and sweet. It's the way they grow. Right, what else have we got? Sorry, this was a very long, elaborate question. I think I've covered all of it now. The other thing that does come in is that the lady in question had heard, you know, some say, it is said that when a plant's actually in bloom, you should stop feeding it. There may be a bit of logic there, I suppose, if the only thing it's doing is blooming and all of the blooms are open. Because the plant is now static. It's not doing anything anymore. It's done all the work, got the blooms open. Yeah? It's not pushing up any new growths or roots at the moment. It's just sitting there looking pretty, in bloom. Should you water and feed it? Well, certainly you should water it. It needs to stay hydrated or your blooms will wilt. Yeah, number one. And number two, with me, I can't be bothered to take that one or two plants out of my watering regime and change it. So I just carry on. What would happen in the wild? You got 6 dendrobiums along a big long branch with a load of moss and a couple of bromeliads and some other stuff, and 2 of them are in bloom. Are they going to get any different treatment to the other 4? No. So I can't be bothered to chop and change. What I do chop and change is the strength of my feed for the time of year, based on mine. In a lot of cases with my orchids, the lower temperatures generate slow rates of growth, and in some cases what is in effect a stall. They stop growing. Yeah? If they've stopped growing, they certainly don't need much water and they need virtually no feed until they start again, yeah? Which is coming soon. Within the next 3 or 4 weeks, stuff's going to really kick off in here that hasn't been doing much for a while. So I'll increase my watering frequency, and within that I'll change my feeding frequency. My normal pots, stuff like this, green stuff up here, not the Masdevallia, yeah? Stuff like that, stuff like this, these sorts of things. During the winter they get a low level feed, and then literally 8 to 10 days later they get a flush. And 8 to 10 days later they get a low level feed. That's it, through the winter. That goes on for a few months, but this time of year the frequency will change. So instead of waiting 8 to 10 days, it might only be 6 to 8 days, and then eventually it'll be down to like 4 or 5 days. So that's the frequency of watering, and then I'll change from feeding low level to increasing the level, followed by increasing the feed frequency, up to the point when they're in their maximum growth, right in the centre of the growing season, when everything's growing as well as it can be. They'll get fed 3 times and flushed once, and they'll get fed at a higher level. So I adjust my frequency and my strength for the growing season, and that's it. That's about the only adjustments I do. I do chuck in some calcium nitrate now and again, a little bit of a boost of the calcium. There's calcium in my feed. I could not bother with that. Occasionally they might get some CalMag, which is calcium and magnesium and some extra iron and a little bit of nitrogen. Do they need it? It's in the feed. It's questionable whether you need to muck about like this all the time. If you've got a reasonable feed, quite honestly you can just get on and use it and things will be okay. But we always strive to do better. That's the goal, is can my plants do any better? And that's where all the faffing around with the different feeds and stuff comes into question. Unless you're going to do precise experiments, you're never going to know whether it all works or not? My easy answer is keep your plants alive, keep them growing and getting them to bloom is the thing that's most important. And faffing about with all the feed and all the stuff like that is probably not going to make much difference. You might think it should do. In reality, it probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference. They'll do okay. Yeah. If you want peak performance, specimen plants off to shows, winning prizes and stuff like that, then you might need to do a bit of extra work. If your plants are sitting at your home and never pay a visit anywhere else, do you need to? So stop and think like that. So it's a long subject, and I find it a tedious subject on the grounds that it will not go away. I'd like to be able to put a knife in it and kill it once and for all so that it never comes up again. But it can't be done because it can be come at from many different angles, different times a year, different plants. You can keep on and on about feeding and watering, and the subject will not go away. The only way you can get it to go away is for you to make your mind up what you're going to do and just do it and blow what anybody else says. Which is almost the state I'm in now. I don't worry what other people say. I'm knowledgeable enough that I know what all the elements do, their interactions with each other, and how they can get out of balance and spoil things, mess things up, and how to keep everything on the straight and narrow. So I'm okay with what I do now. If somebody comes up with a brilliant new idea, I might change my ways. But you're going to have to really back it up. I'm quite happy to just float away doing what I do, and my plants don't do bad. Yeah, I've got some that don't do very well at all. There's normally other reasons besides feeding and watering for them to be in that state. Yeah, it's not normally the feeding and watering that messes them up. Yeah, so again, it's the bottom line, isn't it? Don't get bogged down. So that's my take on all that lot, and I will always take one step back and think what would happen in the wild, and then elaborate for the more complex and more vigorous orchids that we will come across in the more complex hybrid scenarios, where they are incredibly vigorous plants. It's been bred into them. They're going to use more nutrients. They're going to need a better supply and a more frequent supply. That's just how they are. That's our fault for messing about with nature. But the species, quite honestly, everybody says, oh, they're more difficult to look after. Well, they're getting their environment right is the more difficult bit. The feeding and watering isn't, because they just don't need much. That's how they are. Yeah. It's only when you get to the more complex stuff and the more vigorous stuff. I mean, if you take that monster up there, that sea of green up there, it's actually a species. That's a vigorous plant. I believe, in my mind, that that plant does it all on its own, and somehow or other it's adapted to make better use of the small amounts of feed it would get in the wild. It's a species that does exist hanging off a tree somewhere in the world, that big, great big pseudobulbs, big strappy leaves, and it's doing that next to perhaps a little oncidium species that's a very slow grower with, you know, with small leaves and small little pseudobulbs, and they're both managing on the same resources. So yeah, do we need to worry? Well, yes and no. You choose whether you want to worry or not. I'm not going to choose for you. I've given up worrying. I don't worry anymore. I'm quite happy with what I do, and it seems to work reasonably well most of the time. And to worry about it is a bother factor, and I just can't be. It's as simple as that. I can't be bothered with that side of life dominating. I'm more interested in growing my plants well. Part of that is feeding and watering, getting them in the right media, repotting them at the right time, yeah, giving them the right light, all that sort of stuff. I do a bit of worrying about and make adjustments. I don't want to add in worrying about different types of feed. Different strengths, yes. Different types, can't be bothered. So you choose, you have to make your own minds up. All I can do is put my take out there, which you can then take or leave, or bit of it, not that bit, I'll have that bit, I like that bit, don't like that bit. You do what you choose. I never ever profess to be able to tell anybody else how to grow their orchids. I can only advise based on what I've done, or I'll add in the expression some say or it is said, which means that's not my knowledge, that's somebody else's. And again, you take it or leave it. And there's an internet out there if you want to do your own research and do your own work. Yeah, you know, sometimes perhaps it pays to do a bit yourself, not rely on somebody else. Take the easy road all the time. Anyway, that's enough waffle. My coffee's stone cold, and I've got a different day today. I've got a computer day today, so I need to get on with it. Probably means backache. Still, got to be done. I've got lots of work stacking up here. So, see you next time. I'm sorry that was as long as it was, but it's an intricate subject. There's lots of little pathways through it and around it, and above it and below it. But it's a worrying factor if you let it. Otherwise, it isn't.